My name is Bob Muglia. I joined Microsoft in January of 1988, and I left in September of 2011. So 23 years. I started out as the first technical person, the program manager on SQL Server. And then when I left Microsoft, I was president of Server and Tools. So I was born in Connecticut, but I left the East Coast when I was 3 years old, spent 1 year in the Pittsburgh area, but then I really grew up in Michigan from elementary school through high school. I was an only child. I think I was always a geek, basically. I don't know if we called ourselves geeks back then, but I think I was always a geek. I was playing with technology and Heath kits and things. And this was really before there were personal computers. I remember when it was the late 70s when, the Altair started appearing and that became very interesting to me. I went to the University of Michigan. When I graduated from the university, I left pretty much immediately to come to the West Coast, to California, where I worked at a company that built telecommunication systems for business, the first digital PBX, a company called Rome in the Santa Clara area. I met my wife there, Laura Ellen. She'd been keeping track of what was happening in the technology industry, and she had made the statement that the PC is the future. This was 1985. The PC is the future. And, although companies like Lotus are really interesting, Microsoft has both the operating systems and the applications, so that positions them better. And so she really was the one that sought out a job at Microsoft. And short story was when she was going through the interview process, the job wasn't right for her at the time, but they did have but there was a role that was appropriate for me. It was a Sunday evening. I remember I was in my wife's condo, our condo at the time, down in the Bay Area, and it was 8, 9 o'clock at night. I was asleep on the couch, I recall, and I got a phone call, and remember these are landlines back then, right? Because people didn't have cell phones in 87, and I got a call from Rob Glazer, and it was like, wake up. Because Rob, if anyone knows Rob, he is a super high energy, super intelligent, no BS kind of guy. And so I talked to Rob, and a week or so later, I was up here for an interview and then took the job of program manager for SQL Server. So my job when I arrived at Microsoft, and really, in a way throughout my whole career, was to be a program manager. I mean, I eventually became a vice president and a president eventually, but ultimately I was still program managing in some senses. The job was to be a technical representative that is a part of the product team that works very directly with customers to understand their needs and to specify products that met those needs, based on the technology we had and we could build. And then to make sure they could go to market and be effectively sold and everything else, making sure everything works, making sure everything across from the conception of the product through its delivery and then its maintenance and everything else, that all meets the needs of the customer and solves a problem that needs to be solved. My career path is different than most at Microsoft in that I didn't stay in one group for very long. I would go into something, spend a year or 2 years in it, made a number of changes, and then were frequently asked to move on. And I was always asked to move on. It was the company saying, Bob, we would like you to move into this role and start working on this team. So I went from SQL Server to OS2 to just sort of naturally turning into Windows Server to running the developer tools group for a year. That was the time, that was literally the year we built Visual Studio. And after Visual Studio, I did a year in the server world, running Exchange and SQL. And then I moved into Office for a couple of years, ran all of Office. That was when we built SharePoint. Steven Sinofsky was actually working for me at the time. And then after that, I moved into MSN and the services world as we were building the .NET architecture, which we called at the time. And we did Forum 2000, where we were transitioning to be a services company. And then after that, I came back in server and started with I actually started doing something small in server, just building a new type, just focusing on building a different kind of file server, a NAS file server, and network attached storage file server, but that turned into Windows Server, and then System Center, and then and then eventually all of Server and Tools. So I did a lot of different things along the way. I mean, I think people saw me as a fixer, to be able to fix things that that had problems, and so they were using me in that way. And I think it comes back to the sort of the fundamentals, I think, of leadership, which is all, to me, can always be summed up down to three things that you always have to do in leadership. And if you do these three things correctly, you can be successful. You're not always successful, but you can be successful. And if you don't do these things, you're likely to fail. And that is, you need to build the right strategy. And I think I'm quite good at that, and understanding the world, understanding technology, understanding people, and then intuitively understanding what products need to be built and how they need to come to market. It's the right strategy. You need the right structure, organizational structure, and then you need the right people. And if you have those three things, strategy, structure, and people, you can, that is the secret to success in leadership. And in fact, to me, it's the definition of leadership. If you go back to the early days and how Microsoft was organized, it was pretty much split from a product perspective from apps and systems. So there was the apps group that like Jeff Rakes was running, and there was the systems group that Paul Moritz was running. And I was part of the systems group. And I think particularly for systems, IBM was a very dominant part of our thinking back then. Basically, all of our revenue came in connection, from a DOS perspective, was coming through our relationship with IBM that we had, and then the OEMs that we were able to build around it, like Compaq. But IBM was the big company. I mean, Steve used to call it the big bear that, we had to dance with. It was, I think, one of the company meetings, he said, you want to get close, but not too close. and that's sort of how we tried to work with IBM. And we really were working very hard when I got there to make it successful. After I spent about a little over a year in the SQL Server group, I actually took a new role, again under Paul, running program management for OS2. So I was the OS2 program manager, and this was in the last days of OS2. And at the time, Paul was traveling back to Boca Raton. It seemed like every week he was there. And I just remember vividly one morning, he had just come back. I mean, he just gotten back. He spent the night, the day there. He got to take the early flight or whatever. And he comes into his conference room and he says, "It's not going to work." And what he meant was the relationship was not going to work. And that really was the end. That day was the end. And then it just had to unwind. It took about 3-4 months to unwind. So when we made the decision to split with IBM, and it was pretty scary because they were so much larger than we were at the time. But I was right in the middle of all of that because I was helping to define where we were going. In fact, I was one of the guys that gave gave talks about that as the decisions were being made when we were in the process of splitting. And my role shifted. Basically, what happened was we'd had a Windows team working, and we'd had an OS2 team, and the OS2 team really turned into the Windows NT team. So I went into that group. And, in parallel, because we had to make life as complicated as possible, not only were we going to build this new operating system called Windows NT, but we were going to put a whole set of technology on top of it that was known as Cairo to execute against Bill's 1990 Comdex vision of information at your fingertips. This idea that we can use our PCs at the time to ask any question and, find things out. It seems almost a little quaint now in some senses, but back then it was very much, that's not what you did. You went to a library if you had to look things up. So this vision Bill had of information at your fingertips, that you could look up information and find things easily, was extremely visionary. And we sought to build that technology using this project called Cairo, which unfortunately largely got off the rails. When I came to Microsoft, and we first got here, we used to say we had a maniacal work ethic. I don't think they say that anymore, but we used to say that was one of Bill's lines, a maniacal work ethic. And that fit in well. I didn't mind doing that at the time. This was in the late 80s, early 90s. So in the early days, Microsoft was, very much a objectives-driven company. We were very, very focused on what we were trying to accomplish and being successful at it. And we had a very much a winner-take-all strategy, approach. We felt like we could really win things. And Microsoft had some tremendous success. It had success with things like DOS. We did have success with Windows. We certainly had success with early products like Excel and Word. And of course, our languages. But the company was very driven. I think one of Steve and Bill's great things that they did early on was they were willing to make bets on things. And then when they weren't successful, instead of like holding people accountable and firing people, et cetera, they just said, what did we learn from that? And how can we move on? What can we take forward? What can we learn from it and move on? And we did that a lot. And it was part of their calculation that would happen. So I think that's one of the great things Microsoft has always done, is it's been willing to say, hey, we were wrong about this. We'll do this differently. It was really special being at Microsoft in the early days because we were doing something that nobody else was really doing. We were changing the way people work with information in more fundamental ways than any other company on the planet at the time. And one of the biggest things we were doing that I'm maybe as proud about as anything is that we were democratizing the access to information. Go back to the 1980s, people had computers, but they were very expensive and only some companies had access to it. By bringing out products like Windows and Windows Server, we were able to automate businesses in ways that they could never be automated before. That transition from a pen and paper sort of approach to doing business to a spreadsheet and tax system and business accounting system, all of those sorts of things happened on Microsoft software. I used to say that in the early days of the technology industry, the center of the technology industry was clearly in Silicon Valley. But in the 1990s, it moved up to Redmond. One of the reasons why people came to Microsoft in the 1990s was because you could change the world here. And that was a big part of what we would say to people that we were interviewing, which is come to Microsoft and change the world. I remember that very clearly with Joe Belfiore when I hired Joe, because Joe was just out of college and he was an Apple guy and he wanted to work for Apple. And if he didn't work for Apple, he was very clear. He interviewed me and I was running Windows NT at the time and program management. And he was very clear when he interviewed me that it was a wasted interview because he wanted to work on the Macintosh. And so he either wanted to work for Apple or he wanted to work in the Office group. And so what I said to Joe was, I said, Joe, you can do that. And you'll just be one guy, in a machine, or you can come to Windows and work on the UI and change the world. And that's exactly what he did. The common theme throughout my career, you can sort of call it my legacy, is really the impact that I had on growing the business side of Microsoft, and in particular the server business. That was really the center of most of my career at Microsoft. And we started with basically nothing. And when I left, Azure was in its formative stages. And we had a very large, $15 billion plus server business. And we were, and as I mentioned, one of the biggest impacts that is how that changed the way business works and the way small business in particular is automated. You have to remember how it used to be in the 1980s, where everything was manual. Can you imagine just today? I mean, everything has changed in this, but it started, and now it's services, of course. Now it's the cloud. People aren't putting servers on premises, but that's because we don't have to anymore. It was the technology that we built that made the difference. And then, the fact that as a part of that, we built an entire industry around us. The partner focus of the company, allowed so many people to be successful on top of Microsoft software. Microsoft has had an impact on the world really since the 1980s. I mean, since we first started building PCs and our software was a part of them. You remember our mission in the early days was a PC on every desktop and in every home, running Microsoft software. And we achieved that mission. And now Satya has really refocused the company on empowering people to be successful with, using software and technology. And I think when people think about technology, Microsoft is one of the first things people think about. And it's software and technology is a part of all of our lives in everything we do. And that's just becoming more and more true every day as the company grows and as artificial intelligence takes on a bigger role. I think Microsoft still is the right place. I think Microsoft still is the place where you can make a huge difference. You can still change the world.